Jerome Powell, the president of the central bank in the USA, shocks the markets with his latest statements in a new interview. The markets are initially selling off massively here, and Bitcoin is slightly dragged down, although Bitcoin is holding up relatively well. He talks about cryptocurrencies, and thus also about Bitcoin, and even positively about the whole thing, that it's now entering the mainstream, and that they want to reduce crypto banking regulation to foster innovation. It is being promoted as hyper-bullish. On the other hand, he also makes it very clear that the Fed will not intervene here. The Fed will not bail out the markets. The Fed will not play the big savior here. And that's what all the markets have been hoping for in recent weeks. Jerome Powell is shattering all these dreams here. I have also reported from time to time that there are tendencies for the Fed to step in here. But Jerome Powell says, no, we will not save the markets here. He even says that the US debt is not unsustainable. So, from the way it sounds, he is relatively relaxed about the debt level of 37 trillion US dollars. So, that was an absolute shocker here for the market. Elon Musk always says that if things continue like this, the US will quickly drift into bankruptcy. But Jerome Powell says, no, there's no problem here with the national debt. If he is really speaking the truth here, then that means we cannot expect a liquidity injection right now. And thus, Bitcoin and the traditional financial markets must first live with higher interest rates. We are now taking a very close look at what Jerome Powell said, because he first gave a speech today, or rather, we have had the videos since yesterday. He gave a speech, and then he gave the interview. In my assessment, the interview was much more explosive than the speech. It is usually the case that after the speeches, the interviews, the question and answers are much more insightful, because that's when critical questions and so on are sometimes asked. And then, of course, we also address why this is bearish for the markets, but tends to be bullish for crypto. So actually he measures here, Bitcoin should also be sold off much further, because what he said is so bearish. But because he gives positive signals towards cryptocurrencies, the market might not have taken it so badly. At least the crypto Bitcoin market. I mean, the normal, traditional market, that was a disaster. We also see it here in the Nasdaq, which has dropped nearly 900 points. Here, the entire markets, everything is deep red, because simply here, yes, the Fed is cleaning up. It is announced here, or rather it is announced, that the Fed Putin will not come and Jerome Powell will not save the markets. There were such articles recently, like on the 11th April, where it was said, Federal Reserve absolutely ready to help stabilize market if needed, top official says. And back then, the markets were still very bullish, very dovish. People thought, okay, Jerome Powell will announce it here. Maybe QE will be announced. There was also always the theory, okay, if Donald Trump raises all the tariffs so high and if a 10-year government bond comes under pressure here and they don't shoot to the ultimate, then Jerome Powell will simply step in, and so on. But it's not quite as simple as imagined here. Jerome Powell also said things here that we'll look at later, which are not necessarily meant to please Donald Trump. In the meantime, there was also an investigation here to see if Jerome Powell could possibly be removed, because that's exactly what Donald Trump doesn't want. Donald Trump doesn't want Jerome Powell to not stimulate the markets here, to continue slowing down the markets, to pull out liquidity. But Jerome Powell says here quite clearly, understandably perhaps, that there are inflation risks. The markets, also with the tariffs, and so on, all of this is inflationary. And as the Federal Reserve, you can't necessarily massively stabilize the markets or flood the markets with liquidity. Here are his exact statements. The economic impacts of the tariffs will be greater than expected. And higher tariffs than expected mean high inflation and slower growth. That's why today's statements were so important, because we could simply take that away from it. But hey, folks, let's dive right in. Jerome Powell, the big boss of the central bank, let's see what he has to say about the market crash first, and then we'll also check out what he has to say about cryptocurrencies. Or rather, when I say about the market crash, he didn't speak about the market crash, but he made statements that caused the market to crash. That's how it should be said.
Seen some volatility, especially stock market volatility. I mean, the levels of the VIX are up to the levels they were in the early days of the pandemic, coming off somewhat now. Some people believe the Fed will intervene if the stock market plummets, the so-called Fed put. Are they correct?
I'm going to say no with an explanation. So what I think is going on in markets is markets are processing what's going on. And, it's really the policies, particularly the trade policy. And really the question is, where's that going to come in? Where's that going to land? And we don't know that yet. And until we know that, you can't really make informed assessments that would still be highly uncertain. Once you know what the policies are, it'll still be highly uncertain what the economic effects will be. So markets are struggling with a lot of uncertainty, and that means volatility. But having said that, markets are functioning, conditional on being in such a challenging situation. Markets are doing what they're supposed to do. They're orderly, and they're functioning just about as you would expect them to function.
So this is obviously a slap in the face at first, because many also know, okay, hey, a lot depends on liquidity. Even with Bitcoin, if we're being completely honest, we always see that the big breakouts happen when liquidity goes up. The question is also whether Jerome Powell is really telling the truth here. Says, in my opinion, he doesn't want to overstimulate the markets here either. Let's say, maybe right now. But we all know that when push comes to shove, Jerome Powell will print. Jerome Powell will definitely print. He will print as much as possible. He will print until he can't anymore, but for now, in the short term, he won't. He's talking about the markets, saying that there is currently a lot of uncertainty in the markets. That's why there's all this volatility. I mean, it's also driven by politics. That must be clearly stated. I mean, Donald Trump makes a statement. 2 hours later, he revises the statement. Then he makes another statement and revises it again, and so on. And that moves the markets up and down. And many have assumed that this tactic of uncertainty by Donald Trump is being used to get the central bank to lower interest rates, because that simply brings uncertainty to the markets. Then the markets crash. And the theory of many people was simply that Donald Trump is playing 5D chess here, and the central bank eventually concludes, okay, all this uncertainty needs to be stopped by flooding everything with money printing. And that would have certainly worked. One could have definitely covered up all this uncertainty here, and it could have brought a lot of security by simply stimulating and printing money endlessly. But Jerome Powell says that this very uncertainty leads to that the central bank is not budging here, that the central bank is not lowering interest rates. This means, possibly, there is also a battle here, Jerome Powell against Donald Trump. Maybe Jerome Powell wants to give back at Donald Trump. I don't know. Oh, check this out. My cat is back in action. Come on, let's go over and ask. What do you think? When will the central bank intervene again? Start the money printers? When will that happen? When will the money printers start? And when will Bitcoin pump? Right. Crazy upwards? What do you think? So the cat also thinks we need to chill a bit first. But sooner or later, the epic Valhalla pump will come. Jerome Powell also says that the markets are currently processing what's happening here. That means, and as long as everything is in this processing phase, the central bank simply can't step in. Because the central bank first needs to know which direction things are heading. And that's the funny thing. That maybe this is just my assessment. But it actually looks to me like Donald Trump has harmed himself here. If this really is Donald Trump's strategy, here, to pressure the central bank to lower the interest rates. So, Jerome Powell is making completely different hints than what many people here have suspected. So either Donald Trump has no plan, or the plan is backfiring, or Jerome Powell is lying. So, there are now 3 possibilities. And now let's see what Papa Powell has to say about crypto, Bitcoin, and about.
How do you see the potential for more favorable regulations coming on them and potential risks from that for the system?
So we went through a wave of failures and fraud and things like that were the headlines for a couple of years. And I think what you see now is, and during that period, by the way, we worked with Congress to try to get a framework, a legal framework for stablecoins, which would have been a nice place to start. We were not successful. I think that the climate is changing, and you're moving into sort of more mainstreaming of that whole sector.
That's already very, very bullish here. He was asked here, what now? His scenario is for crypto and the whole story, the entire digital asset market, and so on. And he just said we were in a big period of failure, of scams, and so on. So there were, of course, a lot of fraud schemes. I mean, I recall FTX, and whatever else there was. But he also clearly says, hey, they tried to push through a stablecoins framework or something like that, but it didn't really work. And he says, however, now it's moving in a mainstream direction. That means, okay, now, Donald Trump, the USA, and so on are dealing with Bitcoin, with crypto. And the whole thing is now reaching more of the masses. Accordingly, the regulation is also being somewhat relaxed here. And potentially, as I hear it, it's more of a positive movement that can be taken from this. So there are definitely positive statements towards Bitcoin, towards crypto. I mean, he's not mentioning Bitcoin directly. He's always talking about the whole market, but potentially it's already very, very positive to take from this.
So Congress is again looking at both the Senate and the House are looking at a framework, a legal framework for stable coins. Depending on what's in it, that's a good idea. We need that. There isn't one now. And stable coins are a digital product that could actually have fairly wide appeal and should contain consumer protections of the typical sorts and transparency. And that's what the Senate and the House are working on. So that's a positive thing.
Now it's about stablecoins, or as Jeff Booth puts it, guaranteed loss coins, which is what stablecoins are. So stablecoins are nothing more than fiat money, like dollars, but digitized on the blockchain level. This still means that you are potentially being dispossessed. It still means that you are losing purchasing power, and so on. But he says that they want to develop a framework here, which could potentially be a positive story, because he also knows that the demand for US dollars through stablecoins will increase. I think the Trump administration is so keen on stablecoins, God better than Donald Trump. They are all very keen on stablecoins because they want to bring down the 10-year yields from the government bonds. And for that, they need stablecoins so that the US dollar finds more buyers. And stablecoins are simply the optimal vehicle for this. And also the Fed or Jerome Powell say here, yes, they are open to stablecoins. This can potentially be regulated a bit better. But we definitely need it, and it will promote innovation in the USA. I'm always a bit critical here because a stablecoin is also something like a CBDC, light. It can be used as a surveillance tool and such, and it's not really for the good of the citizens, because the whole thing is still an inflationary currency. And stablecoins still mean expropriation. Stablecoins still mean central bank. Stablecoins still mean no sovereignty. Yes, maybe you have a bit more sovereignty if you can now hold the dollar on your ledger or on your TREZOR or whatever other hardware wallet you have. By the way, if you're still looking for an optimal hardware wallet, I always recommend a TREZOR hardware wallet. I'll put a link for you below. Here you can even get a 10% discount with the code Bitcoin Hotel if you write it in lowercase. Bitcoin Hotel, written in lowercase. The absolute recommendation is that you don't leave your Bitcoin on an exchange, but always transfer it to a hardware wallet. Definitely. Let's continue to see what else he has to say.
I also think some of the, we took a pretty conservative, and other bank regulators took an even more conservative perspective on the guidance and rules we imposed on banks. I think there'll be some loosening of that, and I think we'll try to do it in a way that preserves safety and soundness, but that permits and fosters appropriate innovation, but that does so in a way that again doesn't put consumers at risk in ways they don't understand or make banks less safe and sound.
The last part here is almost the most bullish thing he says. He simply says, hey, they want to reduce regulation for banks here so that they can trade better with crypto and so on, so that they can also use Bitcoin and such better. I mean, for banks, this is always relevant. For example, if they simply hold assets here, if they themselves hold Bitcoin here, or maybe have some Bitcoin businesses or crypto businesses and so on going. You have to know, you can always say, okay, what do banks have to do with Bitcoin? But banks are also a very, very big lever. They have a lot of customers. If a bank here decides to go with Bitcoin, with crypto or something like that, then suddenly hundreds of thousands or millions of people are on board at once. And that's why it's a very, very good thing. But the central bank is opening up to all the Bitcoin, crypto stuff, and so on. I mean, they're doing it here now. No distinction between Bitcoin and crypto. So Jerome Powell once said that he sees Bitcoin similarly to gold. He also mentioned in a question and answer session when he was asked what he thinks of Bitcoin. And he said, hey, clearly it has similar properties to gold, but it can't be a competitor to the US dollar because it's not a means of payment, but rather it's seen more as a store of value. Definitely very controversial, what Jerome Powell said here. Write in the comments below what you think about it. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below for you. 21 Bitcoin, how you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code Bitcoin, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. See you? Until then, peace out.